The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this James Cooper Creston charity webinar. We've got a good number of people on the webinar, a mix of trustees and charity management. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of the Charities and Education team at James Cooper Creston, and I'm joined by Alex Peel. He's our head of our audit and assurance team, and he also works with many charities. So we're going to be covering topical issues for charities today. The webinar is designed to last around 30 minutes. Hopefully you've got all the slides on your screens in front of you, and you also have the facility to answer questions, which we will take at the end. Very much a whistle-stop tour of four key topics. So looking at the structure of the session, we're going to cover reserves and financial resilience first, which has been a key theme for charities for some time now and is likely to remain so into the future. Secondly, we're going to cover fraud and cybercrime. As I'm sure all of you will be aware, a very topical issue at the moment, particularly in light of technology and banking issues, etc. Thirdly, we'll look at enhancing trustee skills and experience, which has certainly been a key focus for the Charity Commission in recent times, and I think there have been a number of charity failures which have been attributed to inadequate trustee skills and experience. And finally, we're going to look at maintaining the reputation of charities, which has been very topical in the last 3 or 4 months. So I'm going to hand over now to Alex, who's going to cover the first two of those topics. Alex.
Thanks very much, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody, from me. So first of all, we're going to have a look at reserves and what they are and why a charity should have them, and what you need to do about your reserves, and particularly what you need to put in your annual report. I mean, just to start really by defining what we're talking about. Reserves are part of a charity's unrestricted funds that the charity can spend on any of the charity's purposes, and normally we'd exclude from that amount restricted funds, endowment funds, and things like fixed assets, land and buildings. And normally, again, we'd exclude amounts designated by the trustees for particular future spending. So I think that's what we're talking about. It's quite broad. And the Charity Commission published guidance on what a charity should have in their publication CC19, Charity Reserves Building Resilience. There's a lot of information about reserves, reserve policies, and what charities should do. So we're going to talk about what's too much, what's too little, why charities might have reserves, as mentioned, how much they should have in reserve. We'll look at cash. I've mentioned fixed assets, free reserves, and restricted funds and designated funds, and the influence of those two on what level of reserves a charity might choose to have. Risk is very important, as Mike mentioned. Risk has been a key thing and a key theme over the last few years with charities, and it's a two-sided thing, really. We'll come on to that, and also what charities could do with their reserves. What is the right amount, and should charities be doing something with them? So before we move on, I thought it would be useful just to have a little question, which is fairly straightforward, really, which you should see on your screen. And the question is, are your charity's reserves too high, too low, just right, or don't know? So if you can click an answer to that question. There's no right answer, I don't think, and we can't see who's replying which answer, so we can't see what your answer is. I think most people have voted, but if you haven't, then a few more seconds on that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so we'll close that down now. So interestingly, 60% think that their reserves are just right, which is interesting. Nobody thinks their reserves are too high, which is also quite interesting. But 20 people don't know. 20% of people rather don't know. So hopefully the people in the don't know category might have some more information about the subject by the end of today. So reserves policies then, well, why do we have reserves? I mean, ultimately, there are a number of reasons for having them. And charities are all different, and there are many different reasons why a charity might have reserves. Some of the reasons are listed up on your screens. In some charities, they're going to give confidence to funders that the charity is well run, well managed, that you've got the ability to keep continuing in operation. And linked with that, it demonstrates the resilience of the charity and the ability to manage difficulties, keep going when times get tough. Often beneficiaries actually need more, so it demonstrates that you can keep doing that. The reserves policy, of course, will give funders an understanding of why they need to give funding to the charity, and often a key aspect of the disclosure in a set of financial statements in the charity's annual report is the balance between sort of explaining why the charity has money, the fact that they do have money to demonstrate resilience, but also not wanting to put off voluntary funders because they might think that the charity actually has plenty of funds already. Obviously, having a policy and having reserves gives assurance to lenders and creditors of that charity. It manages a risk to reputation, and as I mentioned, some charities do have significant amount of reserves. However, they do need to hold reserves because they have big plans for the future, or they know what they're going to spend the money on in the future. So having a policy that sets out why they need reserves and how much they need explains why it is that the charity is sitting on a reasonably large amount of money. Having reserves again and having a policy assists in planning, and of course it informs the budget and risk management process for the future. So in terms of what a charity should do then, in the publication CC19, the Charity Commission set out a number of ways of designing a reserves policy, and they set out a number of things that all charities should disclose in terms of that reserves policy. And I think the first aspect of that is obviously why the charity needs reserves. As mentioned, there are many reasons why a charity might need reserves. They might need them for working capital purposes because funding isn't spread equally through the year. So to be able to pay salaries, to pay other costs, they might need a certain amount of working capital, which is effectively their reserves. They might need them because actually they're saving up for a new asset in the future. It might be that they've identified that they want to buy a particular asset or buy a building, and that sort of thing. But they in the financial in the section of the annual report, the charity needs to explain why they hold reserves. They then need to go on to say the amount they hold at the moment. Because of the way a charity's accounts are presented, often there are restricted funds, unrestricted funds, designated funds, fixed assets involved in there. So it's not immediately obvious sometimes from just looking at the balance sheet what the level of reserves is. So the charity needs to explain what they believe the reserves are. Looking at that, as I mentioned earlier, normally restricted funds are excluded from the reserves figure. And again, normally designated funds are also excluded because it's clear from the accounts that the trustees has designated those funds to be used for a particular purpose. Once we've said why reserves are held and how much it is currently held, the annual report needs to also explain how much they think they need. It might be that that's already been done in terms of explaining why reserves are held, but ideally the report would quantify how much. So it might be that they only need 200,000, 300,000, it might be that they need 5 million or whatever it is, but normally you would quantify how much was needed and then go on to explain how current reserves actually compare with that ideal amount. And then if the current reserves are higher than is needed, the report would go on to explain what the charity was doing, i.e. we're going to spend the money in the next few years, or as would appear to be the case from the poll that we just did, if the charity hasn't got the reserves that they want, the report would normally explain what the charity was doing to build up that reserves level. I think it's worth saying that there's no right answer to this, and charities will all have different requirements, they'll all have different policies, charity trustees will all have a different attitude to risk, and so it isn't really possible to say all charities should sort of follow a certain rule of thumb or whatever. However, there are some typical measures that charities do use. Aside from charities that are saving up for a particular thing, often a charity might use a number of months worth of expenditure as a measure. They might use the salary cost for a certain amount of time, and perhaps add to that the cost of closing down the charity if that had to happen in the future. And again, there's no right period of time. Typically charities might go for 3 to 6 months worth of expenditure, something along those lines, but it really will depend on the charity and what it is the charity wants to do and what the trustees believe they should be doing. As I mentioned, the reserves policy and the reserves very much links in with risk management. And we've sort of covered some of these areas already. As part of preparing the annual report, the trustees will normally should be looking at the risks that the charity faces, and that will include financial ones. And normally you would tie those in with the reserves policy to a certain extent as well. And that is obviously also linked to financial resilience. One of the reasons for having reserves, as we mentioned, is it makes the charity more resilient in the future, and allows the charity to continue going, perhaps in hard times, perhaps in times where actually the need of a beneficiary increases, but income of the charity decreases. And we saw that a lot over the sort of the 2010-11 period, where actually charity incomes were down quite significantly, but the need for beneficiaries increased, and a lot of charities were making deficits and were slightly concerned about that, but actually that's why they had their reserves. They sort of planned well in the past and planned for the future, and were using their reserves. So that is probably all I wanted to say for now about reserves and reserve policies. So we'll move on to the second topic, which is charity fraud. So completely different. And I think there are various estimates of the amount of fraud in charities, but depending on who you believe and who you read, that could range from 150 million to 2 billion pounds. And when you consider that UK charity income is 70 billion pounds, certainly at the top end, that's a lot. We'll talk about a couple of different types of fraud, and all of them are topical, unfortunately. We've got obviously external fraud, whereby someone outside the organisation manages to obtain money from the charity that they shouldn't have done. Insider fraud, trustees, sometimes employees and volunteers, and in my work I've seen all of those happen, and we'll talk about a couple of examples in a minute. And there are various things, if a fraud is identified, there are various things which the charity needs to do. There are various reports that have to be made by both the charity trustees and the auditors. For example, reporting serious incidents is required to the Charity Commission, and again there's some Charity Commission guidance on that if you were unlucky enough to have that happen to you. There's a lot of guidance on the Charity Commission website about what to do. So just before we move on, and before you think, oh well, that would never happen to us, a couple of little examples where we have seen fraud over the last few years. The first one is where a financial controller who'd been with the charity a long period of time, for whatever reason, and we still don't really know why, managed to make some payments to himself. Not huge sums of money. We're talking about £10,000, £15,000 in the context of a charity with income of £5 million. And the reason he was able to do that was because he was well trusted, and in the past when someone was off sick, he'd had to have both bank authorisations, so it was possible for him to circumvent the system and load up payments and then authorise as well. He was caught though, and is now no longer with the charity. The second example, it was also a sort of financial controller, and the accountant presented to the chief executive payments for approval. It was a situation where there were a lot of small invoices that were legitimately paid to a particular supplier, but this accountant had faked a number of these small invoices. So they looked real. The chief executive approved them, and once approved, the accountant then went into the system and changed the bank payee details to one of his own bank accounts, made the payments, and then changed the bank account details back in the system. So anyone looking at it would have thought the paperwork and the system all were correct. So it does happen, thankfully not frequently, but people do get away with these sorts of things. So how to respond if a fraud occurs? I think one of the key things is to act very quickly. Obviously an investigation needs to happen, and that will need to consider the extent of the fraud and what might have happened. I think it's very important to stay calm. People get quite emotional when this sort of thing does happen, and it's important to think about it logically, work out who the charity needs to tell, and potentially have a fraud response plan to work out what it is that you're actually going to do. Preserving evidence is very important, so locking down accounting systems, obtaining information perhaps from a bank if necessary, if the information isn't available in-house, is important to do quickly. Banks keep certain amounts of records, and depending on what the fraud is, it's important to go to the bank, one, to get the records, or two, to stop payments or be able to get money back from people. Obviously seek professional advice. It might be from people like ourselves who've seen it before and can assist in investigations, or perhaps from lawyers. And obviously, as we've said, there are various reporting requirements. So obviously charities will want to protect against fraud, and some of this isn't any new. It's not particularly complicated, but I think having strong financial management and good governance is very important. All charities work on the basis that this will never happen to them and everybody can be trusted, and not so much now because checkbooks aren't used quite so much, but I think we've all seen checkbooks where trustees have pre-signed checks because obviously they trust people, but it's where it goes wrong, which is the key thing. So having controls and making sure that they actually are implemented in practice is vitally important. The Charity Commission again publishes a lot of information on the subject. Some charities will be more vulnerable than others. So if you are a charity that handles a lot of cash, you'll be wanting to have certain procedures to ensure that cash is counted and banked in a certain way and is collected from wherever it's donated. Dual authorization of bank transactions is obviously a critical aspect, and just because someone's worked for the charity for a long time and is trustworthy doesn't mean that they should be able to implement sort of two authorizations or approve everything. And being fraud aware is really important, I think. And coming on to cyber fraud, which we'll talk about in a minute, awareness is a key thing. So far we've really talked about internal fraud, and I think it's just worth finishing the fraud section by mentioning cyber fraud, because it's quite frightening really how much this is happening now, and it's increasing all the time. The sorts of things we're talking about here are where people manage to obviously hack into a system, or perhaps just send an email innocently asking for a payment to be made, and that email, they're very clever, and they would make it look like that email comes directly from the financial controller, perhaps to the chief executive, looking for a payment to be made to the supplier urgently. And actually we have seen that in practice, and the lucky thing with these sorts of things is mostly the scammers don't manage to get it quite right, so someone spots it. But I've had a charity client who actually was defrauded through that method, and a payment was made to a bogus supplier. And another example is where a charity provided a service, and they were in the process of doing that. They then had what they thought was their beneficiary who looked like they were cancelling the order, and that beneficiary wanted their money back. The charity paid the money back, but unfortunately that beneficiary was bogus, and the real beneficiary had obviously paid money for something which the charity still had to honour. So there's a lot of ways of doing this. I think awareness is the key. Anyway, enough of fraud. Move back to Mike, who's going to talk about trustee skill and experience.
Thanks very much, Alex. We're running over slightly time-wise, so those of you that like to have your lunch at exactly 1 o'clock, perhaps you can set your time scales to 5 minutes past 1. So the third section that we'll be talking about, trustee skills and experience. What we're looking to achieve here, we've listed on this slide a number of the things that need to be done in terms of making sure that trustee skills and experience do generate benefit for charity. Some of these, to a degree, are motherhood and apple pie. These are all statements that I think it would probably be impossible for anyone to disagree with. Probably one of the key ones, I think, is the clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and particularly within a charity context, the link between trustees and the management team. So if we look at trustee skills, this is perhaps the traditional model by which people have looked at making sure that they have the right trustee skills on the board. I'm listing a whole range of areas, perhaps two worth mentioning. The last two, technical expertise relating to beneficiaries. So for example, if you're a mental health charity, quite useful to have somebody on the board who really understands the detail of mental health and beneficiary need. And increasingly these days, as things get automated and technology changes, having somebody on board who understands technology is really useful. This might mean having a slightly younger person on the board than would normally be the case. Interesting, the average age of charity trustees in the UK remains at 57. So these are the traditional board skills that would be great to have. I think it's fair to say out of the 160,000 charities in the UK, there probably isn't a single one that has all these skills in exactly the right measure that we need. Just going to launch a poll in a second, which hopefully you'll see on your screen. Has your charity carried out a trustee skills audit in the last 2 years? So 4 options: yes, no, you're considering it, or you don't know. So if you could vote now, I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So the answers coming in. Just give you a few more seconds. Okay, I think we'll close the voting now. So around about 50% of you have carried out a skills audit recently. Around about a quarter haven't. A number are considering it. So I think that's probably quite good in the sense that many charities have done nothing about this. So quite a few of you have done it. A few of you perhaps it's worth considering. In terms of a slightly less typical scope of the roles of trustees, those of you that have listened to me on webinars or seminars before will have seen this slide. I think it's a great one in terms of trustee roles, not looking at skills, but the roles that people play on a board. And in those idle moments, perhaps when you're at a charity trustee meeting, perhaps useful to look around the room to see which category people fall into. It's great to have people that cover all of these things, but of course, a bit like the trustee skills, the traditional roles, it's very hard to get exactly what the mix that you need, but continual challenge for improvement, etc. So in terms of trustee recruitment and retention, it's a question of when to recruit. Well, clearly that very much depends on the circumstances of your particular charity. It may be that you need new ways to reach beneficiaries, get some new ideas, perhaps changing technology, you need somebody on the board with those particular skills, or perhaps you just need new ideas and contacts generally. So it does very much depend. Length of service is often an issue. I think it's useful there to have a mix of long-serving and newer trustees. Skills audit, you can do that on an informal basis. If you want to really formalise it, you can get an external party in to do it for you. I think one of the things that often arises from a trustee skills audit is that you find hidden skills that nobody's told you about, and it'd be great if you can do that, and then you can capitalise on those skills. Naturally important to carry out trustee development training. I think it's fair to say that there really probably isn't enough training goes on of charity trustees. An increasing number of charities, particularly slightly larger ones, are doing appraisals of charity trustees. I've been on the receiving end of some of these as I'm a trustee of a number of charities. I think it's fair to say that generally these appraisals are much softer than you might receive in a more commercial environment, but it does enable you to address particular issues. And I think two issues that might get addressed is if a trustee perhaps has an issue around attending enough meetings, or again it might uncover some skills or interests that the trustee have that can benefit the charity. And I think finally on that slide, working with other charities, cross-fertilising, getting people from other charities on your board, perhaps some of your trustees serving in other charities, can be a really useful way to maximise benefit. In terms of how you find new trustees, I think it's great, before you embark on the process, understanding whether a potential trustee has got the time to commit. How many trustees is a question that people often ask. My own personal view is that the majority of charities are sort of medium or slightly larger size. Once you get beyond 10 trustees, it does become quite difficult to manage, but it does really very much depend. In terms of how you encourage applications, often done word of mouth. Social media these days is often useful, and perhaps more traditional advertising routes, possibly linking with other charities to do that. Useful, I think, to emphasise that there are significant benefits of being a trustee, and research has been carried out that being a charity trustee is something that people enjoy. It gives them new skills, it gives them a real feeling of purpose, and often it helps them develop skills which are useful in their day job. So it's not all a one-way street. I think most charity trustees find the role very useful. Increasingly these days, people are carrying out more informal interviews, and perhaps they need to give feedback, going through more formalised induction processes and clarifying roles and responsibilities. People often say, oh, well, just need to attend 4 meetings a year. The reality is that it's not just going to be 4 meetings a year, but there's going to be other stuff to do in between meetings. It's quite useful to make it clear to potential trustees at the start. Diversity, very much flavour of the month. Important to get diversity on your board. Make sure that people are eligible. So, for example, if you're a charity working with children, DBS checks, making sure there are no criminal convictions, etc. Refreshing the trustee board on a regular basis is important. So, for example, if you were a charity with 10 trustees, I personally think it's quite useful to have at least one change in trustee each year. The House of Lords has really recognised the importance of trustee skills, encouraging skills audits, training, induction, etc. And interestingly, did criticise the Charity Commission for its governance procedures. So the final topic, reputation management. Very topical recently, Oxfam, Save the Children and the President's Club. I'm sure you've all heard about these things, and it's been interesting to see how quickly it's possible for a charity's reputation to be diminished if things go wrong. Of course, one needs to look at the reputation of the charity sector as a whole, which is very difficult for you to control. There are 160,000 charities. It's very difficult for you to control what the other 159,999 are doing. But of course, what you can do is help control what happens at your individual charity within a context of increasing scrutiny and external regulation, for example, in the area of fundraising. Risk management is an important thing to carry out to assess what might go wrong. And I think the general view of self-assessment, and perhaps this links with risk, assessing the likely areas where your reputation might be damaged, I think is a great thing to do. Investment is important. I think we do see many charities that perhaps don't look to invest in their infrastructure, ID, training, etc. Things can go wrong. Looking at your external messaging and your communication with the outside world is important. And I think it's fair to say that lots of charities don't demonstrate this as clearly as they might do. And having a contingency plan for how you deal with things when they go wrong. The Charity Commission used to have a document, Hallmarks of an Effective Charity. I used to think it was a great self-assessment document. As ever these days, it's been changed and withdrawn. It's now replaced by the Charity Governance Code. Google it on the internet. Really useful document to work out to see whether your charity is doing the right things in terms of making sure its purpose is clear, behaves with appropriate values, you've got the right decision-making processes in place, your board is working in an effective way, and that diversity is something that you're dealing with to make sure that helps support your effectiveness, leadership and decision-making. And openness and accountability, very important these days. Transparency is a big thing for charity. And then finally, we'll just close with typical areas where things can go wrong. Fundraising, data protection, big issue recent times. Facebook, the fundraising regulator scandals, etc. Really important. There's also the question of your fundraising ratio, i.e. your ratio of fundraising cost to fundraising income. I think you'll often find that charities might come in for criticism if they're spending a lot on fundraising and not generating the income. It goes without saying any charities with vulnerable beneficiaries, safeguarding issues are important, and related to that, and indeed other areas, having appropriate policies in place and making sure that they are applied correctly. External inspections can create issues. So, for example, if you're a school that receives a poor Ofsted inspection, that can create damage for your charity or a Charity Commission investigation. Harder to control overseas activities. Charities potentially moving away from the prime objects can create issues, and there's the thorny favourite political campaigning, which charities aren't supposed to do, but often very grey areas. We've talked, and Alex has talked about the finances, loss of income, overspending, so financial issues can create reputational issues for charities, kids company being the obvious example. Inappropriate expenditure, perhaps carrying out expenditure on things that don't really sit well with your objects. The occasional scandal to do with trustee expenses. Poor governance is a popular one in terms of something that the Charity Commission will investigate. We've talked a bit about the link between trustees and management and making sure that there's no mismatch between the two. Links with non-charitable organisations is something that's important. Some guidance coming out from the Charity Commission. I suppose one of the key examples of that in recent times is Age Concern, who got into difficulties in terms of their links with energy companies. And then finally, poor communication of the impact of what you do. Whilst it's inevitable that for many charities of any size, something will come along the way to damage your reputation, what is really important is you build up a font of goodwill in terms of what you do over a number of years. And so if you do have a strong reputation, it does help you withstand any problems that might arise. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. There's a facility to ask questions on your screen. Alex and I are very happy to deal with any questions. You'll see our contact details. Then I think we've had some questions.
Okay, so yeah, someone's asked who would appraise a charity trustee.
I think it's that's something that perhaps will depend. If I look at the appraisal I have personally been the subject of, in some cases the chief executive of the charity and the chair of trustees. Other charities, it's often the chair of trustees. So I think it's definitely a trustee responsibility, and then a question of whether you get the chief executive involved. I think, as with all appraisals, they need to be seen to be a positive experience rather than something that's critical. But I think they're perhaps the two key individuals that would be involved. Generally, they're relatively shorter than you might receive an appraisal in your job. We have one other question in. Do we have to advertise when we recruit new trustees? I think the answer to that question is that you don't have to. I think historically charity trustees have been recruited through what we might call the old boys network, but I think it's fair to say that these days charities might be subject to criticism if they don't go slightly wider in terms of who they the methods that they use to recruit trustees. So I would say to you that you don't have to advertise, but I think you need to be comfortable with the ways that you're looking to recruit trustees. Make sure that you get a good likelihood of identifying trustees who can really add something to your charity. So I think that pretty much deals with the questions that have come in so far. As I say, any further questions you've got, just contact us. Finally, thanks very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy your lunch. Thank you.